Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to the July MPDC webinar. We are so excited that you are taking some time to join us this afternoon. My name is Lindsay. I am the Director of Marketing and Engagement here at Project Medtech. Very grateful to work alongside my co-host, McKay, and I will let you introduce yourself and your role at MPDC.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks for joining our webinar series. My name is McKay Knoll. I'm the Managing Director of the Midwest Pediatric Device Consortium. We're a resource group that's funded by the FDA to promote pediatric medical device development in a number of different aspects. And excited to have guest speakers in our webinar series talk about some aspects of pediatrics and product development, and grateful for Project Medtech helping as well.
Awesome. Well, I would love to introduce our guest for today. We're so honored and excited to have her. Thank you, Deanna Green, for joining us. And I would love if you wouldn't mind just sharing a little bit about yourself, your background, and maybe what led you to MedTech.
Sure, I can do that. And first, let me just say thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really excited to be here today to talk about topics that are near and dear to my heart and the pediatric population. And I also want to just say that, today is an opportunity to really just, present the current state of pediatric device development. But I also ask everybody to suspend their beliefs and, as we talk, to imagine all the ways that this enterprise, this ecosystem can be the best that it can be. And I think that what excites me about the conversation is because I know there's a lot of folks on the line here who have that same goal and interest as well. So as was mentioned, I've obviously worked in the pediatric space for many years. I'm currently an executive vice president at Canal Row Advisors, which is an FDA consulting firm that I joined just last year in October after spending more than 16 years working at the FDA. During the first half of my career at the FDA, I worked in CDER, the Center for Drugs, for about 8 years in the Office of Clinical Pharmacology, where I served as a medical officer and a clinical pharmacology reviewer, and also as a policy lead looking at developing FDA guidances and policies pertaining to clinical pharmacology considerations. And then the second half of my career, most recently, I had the honor of leading the Office of Pediatric Therapeutics, both as deputy director of that office and then director for the last 5 years. And that office is a congressionally mandated office at the FDA, which is located within the Office of the Chief Medical Officer, which is within the Office of the Commissioner. And I say that because it's important to know that the Office of Pediatric Therapeutics is a centralized group that works across the agency with the Medical Products Center specifically, working with the Center for Drugs and Biologics and Devices, with the goal of helping to advance medical product development for children. And so this office really focuses on cross-cutting issues that impact product development in general, and cross-cutting issues that also impede that for pediatrics in particular. And so during my time in that office, I worked with my colleagues who were in CDRH, particularly the pediatric staff there that were focused on various activities around pediatric regulatory review as it relates to devices, advocating for devices, thinking through policies and strategies and considerations, and worked very closely with the former pediatric chief medical officer there, Dr. Basum Paris. And since that time of leaving the agency, I spend now most of my time consulting with developers, a lot on the drug side, I will say, since I spent a lot of my career in the drug and biologic space, but also on the device side, who are thinking through their programs and strategies and how best to engage with the agency to lead to ultimately a successful goal of having great products out there for patients. So with that, I'll turn it back and look forward to the conversation.
Deanna, thanks so much for that intro and that background. And I know a lot of people get excited when they hear that someone used to work at FDA, and all the questions come to mind about how they might be able to learn about the intricacies of the FDA programs and offices. And knowing your background kind of being in that cross-cutting office where you're looking at different CDRH, drug development, and a couple of others for that cross-cutting interaction, Probably not as detailed for like specific regulatory strategies. So maybe just a broad disclaimer for viewers. If you have questions about like specific regulatory pathways and medical device development for pediatrics, we have our regulatory group here at the MPDC that can help address all those questions. Deanna is here to talk more at a broad level, but the chat is open if you guys have questions throughout our conversation to be able to ask about some of the things we're going to talk about today when it comes to trends, the agency, clinical evidence, and a couple other topics as well. So knowing that this is a time of year where there's lots of conversations about MDUFA fees getting renewed and MDUFA 6 coming up and a lot of user fees coming and new legislation coming up in the next couple of years, we're going to stay away from the politics and we're going to stay away from specific how-tos for different regulatory pathways, but would love to get Deanna's thoughts about the trends and where things have gone. And Deanna, maybe starting there, from your experience and having been in the agency for over 15 years, talk through what the experience has been in terms of pediatrics at large and the landscape of how it came onto the scene, how it's evolved through different parts of the agency or the agency at large.
Sure, but I'd be happy to. And, I think it is important to remember that it was not just that long ago where, pediatric population, unfortunately, was termed as therapeutic orphans. And that was across the board as it relates to having the type of healthcare that they need and the type of medical products that they need for treating their conditions. And some of that had to do with wanting to protect the population, and that is super understandable, of course. But I think there is also a clear recognition that because of that time lost, it really did leave children behind the 8 ball in terms of, our thinking of how best to evaluate products that are being used in children. What are the levels of evidence, how to design trials, how to enroll them safely, but then also how to ensure that ultimately these products are improving their health. And so there's been a trajectory, and I think, many people are familiar with that trajectory. But I have to say, it was an honor working at the agency during my time, and I know and have saw for myself the FDA's strong commitment to supporting the development and availability of safe and effective medical products, including medical devices. And that remains constant. So that's not new, and that's certainly not an evolution. But I have also felt, great excitement to know that that commitment still continues, and it continues to be expressed by CDRH leadership, for example, including the center director, Dr. Michelle Tarver, and by the CDRH staff, that this is a priority for the agency, which is, making sure children have the products that they need. I think over the years, in terms of evolution, what we've really seen is that review divisions across the board have been placing greater emphasis on engaging with developers early in development and providing more opportunities and mechanisms for dialogue about, things like study design or regulatory pathways, and also the unique challenges that, are faced when trying to generate evidence in small and heterogeneous populations, which I think, can accurately describe many pediatric populations. And so then I think that there's been a shift toward increasing flexibility when thinking about evidence, recognizing that traditional large clinical trials, in many cases, not all cases, but in many cases, in certain circumstances, aren't feasible, particularly, for example, for rare diseases, and that things like real-world data, registries, extrapolation from adult experiences and adult data are all important ways for gathering evidence when scientifically appropriate. But at the same time, I do always think it's important to remember that, the agency is clear and the standards are clear, that, there's been flexibility, but that doesn't necessarily mean lowering the bar for safety and effectiveness for products that are going to be used in children, and that they actually have the same standards as adults. So that's no different. But the goal really is to ensure that children have access to innovative technologies while still being able to maintain confidence that those devices are appropriate for their intended use. So I think that's what's exciting, is that, again, the standards are still the same, but how we derive the evidence, how we generate it, how we gather it, and how it then supports use is what continues to evolve.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I know that companies are often trying to find innovative ways to provide that clinical evidence through like real-world evidence or registries and others. Maybe kind of taking, before we dive into the clinical evidence side of it, just if you have comments to what companies should do to prepare themselves when talking to the agency, either about what they're considering to do for clinical evidence or their pathway, and what are some obstacles to avoid or maybe pitfalls to avoid when trying to prepare to go approach the agency to talk about product development at large.
Yes. Yeah, that's a great question. And one of my favorite questions, because it gives me a chance to dispel some myths, I think are hopefully starting to melt away, which is that, the agency is a place to avoid until you absolutely have to
Yeah.
interact with the agency. Again, I was at the agency for 16 years. And I remember when I first joined the agency, it really did seem like that was a very prevalent thought. But I think it's evolved over time, and companies are recognizing that that is not true. So what I would say for sure is that in order to prepare for your programs, because again, with the goal of success, which everyone has from the outset, is that early development is really key. I can't stress that enough, and probably many people have heard that from regulators as sort of a mantra: early and often as needed. And I hope that message is really sinking in, and that companies are heeding that advice and developers are heeding that advice, because especially for pediatric device development, the earlier you can have meaningful scientific discussions with FDA, the better positioned you can be to really make smart decisions about your technology, your evidence strategy, to your point, and ultimately how you bring your innovation to children who need it. And really, depending on the device and the circumstances, there are opportunities to engage with FDA through many mechanisms. There are opportunities for early feasibility discussions, pre-sub interactions, and other mechanisms that really allow you to get important feedback before locking in on key development decisions. And I want to again stress that, because this really can help you avoid costly and time-consuming changes later if it turns out that those locked-in decisions ultimately do not align with FDA's expectations. And it really does end up helping to de-risk your program. Now, some people say, well, if I meet early or if I meet with the agency, they may say something I don't want to hear. But again, this is about de-risking your program for your ultimate goal. These conversations are really intended to be collaborative and iterative. So, if there are things that are going to be absolute requirements and expectations, I think it's good to know that up front and really be able to prepare for them and not have to retrofit that into your program later. The other part I would say about being a productive discussion is that it really is important to come to these interactions well prepared. And, I know that many companies and developers, of course, are doing that. They recognize that these are high stakes interactions. But sometimes, there can be a tendency to come with a bit of a blank slate. You sort of have an overarching idea of
Right.
your goal, of your technology, of what you're trying to do, the population you're targeting. But it's important to remember that FDA is not necessarily going to design your device or your program for you. Instead, the more productive meetings, in my experience, have been the ones where the sponsors and developers are coming with a well thought out and are able to articulate a well thought out strategy, as well as their rationale, the data they've generated so far, assumptions they're making, and also the uncertainties and maybe some of the challenges that they're facing already, and then use those interactions very strategically to pose focused, decision-oriented questions to the agency. And I say that because sometimes, there can be a tendency to pose questions in a briefing book or at the meeting that are more yes, no. And the value that you can really tap out of that ends up being limited,
Right.
as opposed to framing your position, as I mentioned, and framing your questions and posing them in such a way that you're able to get a little bit more specific and tailored advice and feedback from the agency on key aspects that you're proposing in your development program, as opposed to sort of generic high-level answers that are, maybe relevant, of course, to any program, for example. Of course, there's always situations where the FDA may say, it's too premature to comment on something, or it's, we need to understand more, we need more data, that type of thing. And again, this is part of the dialogue. So that again is understandable. So you do have to think about the types of questions depending on the type of interaction and where you are in your program. Of course, you wouldn't want to ask a question that, you've got way more to do before you can even get to that question, for example. But it is still important to be very strategic in how you use that time. And then in terms of evidence, again, for pediatrics, critical to have those conversations with the agency earlier on, even if they're not definitive discussions, to be able to have a conversation about what would an evidence package look like for your particular situation, and what are the types of evidence that could be acceptable. There's so many ways to build the package, whether it's, your engineering data or your bench testing, modeling, clinical data, when appropriate. We talked about real world data, extrapolation, all of those things. Having those conversations just helps you then understand sort of, okay, now how do I best prepare myself to either generate that information or gather it, or, have it be complementary to other aspects that the agency is asking of me. So again, I just can't overemphasize how extremely important it is to be thinking about all of this for every interaction you have. And then lastly, I'll just say, because I know I'm talking, I think we could have a whole session on just this topic, but lastly, I will say is mock meetings. Now, that may not be the most splashiest or exciting aspect of thinking about your FDA meeting, but you don't want to be practicing or rehearsing in the real deal. Again, these are high stakes interactions. So when you have a meeting coming up and there are some key pivotal things that you need to achieve from that meeting, it really would be great to consider mock meetings. And that could just be, again, going through what you hope to gain from the meeting, being prepared and practicing your rationale and justification, having some fallback positions, depending on the response you get from the agency, being already prepared to have that in the back of your mind. You'd be surprised at how then that just helps you go into that interaction with even more confidence, and hopefully better outcomes.
Sure. Yeah, those are great comments. And going back to what you're talking about in terms of like an evidence package and going to the FDA, either by saying, I would assume it would be more productive if you said, here's the evidence strategy that we're currently generating for early feasibility or benchtop testing or first in human, and then presenting that to the FDA and saying, for clearance, here's the direction we're going. Maybe they can't make a determination yet on if that's enough evidence, and they say, come back when you have more data. Mm-hmm. That's a strategy that I assume is true for most approvals, regardless of if it's adult or pediatric or drug or device. Are there specific considerations that pediatrics should keep in mind when it comes to generating that evidence packet or going to the FDA with evidence that is unique to the pediatric population or to Medtech?
Yes. Well, I think a couple of things. It really is about knowing your target population well, knowing, the spectrum, the age groups you're planning to target, and really thinking about, what are, based on the characteristics, what are then the considerations that fall from there? Mm-hmm. Sometimes people can say, well, the easiest, and not necessarily the easiest, but like a rational thought is, I should be able to extrapolate information from another population, adults or what have you, sure, to build my evidence case and do that alone. And there may be some cases, but remember, before you even get there, you'd first have to interrogate that assumption and think about what are the similarities and differences between the populations that would support or negate the ability to do that. And in the device space, sometimes, there are unique considerations around growth and development, on usability around the device, again, depending on what specific context we're talking about, or even how the condition progresses in children that may then limit the ability to leverage some of that information. So, you do certainly take in a stock and an assessment of the available information and data that's there, and then determine whether or not there's going to be additional new pediatric specific information that needs to be generated. And again, it is very case by case, but I mean, I think the general point I'm making though is that, every assumption about your evidence package, you really need to interrogate internally before you then go to the agency again, so that you're coming on your strongest foot, like you're coming with your best position forward.
That's great. And I know that a lot of that evidence generation relies on external parties, sometimes children's hospitals, other institutions, research organizations that are able to generate that data outside of early benchtop or maybe animal testing, and trying to then coordinate as a startup between those research institutions or those hospitals to your company, and then showing that to the FDA. I don't know, is a lot to handle for a startup. And from my perspective, there's obviously the interaction where now you're trying to generate evidence with a pediatric population, and there's some ethical considerations, and there's parents involved. What aspects in that realm should people keep in mind when trying to look at generating clinical research or generating the data for that evidence package?
Yeah, and that's a really great point and segue, because I do think, that is really something important to start with. It is just the state of the situation, which is that children are a vulnerable population, as everybody knows. And it's really because, it is not because they're necessarily frail. It's not because, of course, they don't have diseases and conditions like any other population, but it's because they cannot legally consent for themselves to participate in research. And so as a result, they are afforded additional human subject protections. And those are in place for very important reasons. And so then the challenge becomes, how do you balance really two important goals? Because we all, as wanting to see the best products out there for children, we want to ensure that they have access to evidence-based medical technologies. But we also want to ensure that we're protecting children from unnecessary risk.
Right.
And now if we swing too far in that direction and we say, okay, which was the case in the past, let's exclude children from all research, then that means that they may not have the opportunity to benefit from medical advancements. And they may end up relying only and solely on devices that are being developed for other purposes and that were never actually evaluated for them. So I think it is important when we think about the ethical considerations is to upfront know that they're there for a reason, so that we can ensure that research is scientifically and ethically sound if children are going to be enrolled. And the FDA regulations, and I'll just say the term, hopefully people have heard of it, but the short name is Subpart D. The long name is 21 CFR Part 50 Subpart D. Yeah. And these are the regulations that outline those additional protections that I mentioned that are available and are required actually for children in research. And so let's say a developer, a researcher, a company, when you're contemplating enrolling a child into a clinical trial, you really need to think through the ethical framework because there are a series of questions to consider. First off, is it necessary? I mean, I think that's a critical one in terms of an ethical principle that's at play is scientific necessity. So children should only be enrolled in a clinical trial if the trial is necessary to answer an important scientific or public health question that is pertinent and relevant to the health and welfare of children. And that couldn't be answered in another means. So for example, through the enrollment of adults who can consult or consent for themselves, for example. There are aspects of product development where you do need the data in the patients that are going to be using it, and that's in children. So again, is it necessary, and are you, making sure that question can be answered and should be answered through pediatric research? The next things to think about is what is the level of risk that a child could be exposed to in the trial. And is there a prospect of direct clinical benefit to the individual child who is enrolled? As absent a benefit, a direct clinical benefit, I should say, then the risk to which children exposed in clinical research must be low. And so I think that's important to point out because, as researchers, as investigators, sometimes, there are important scientific questions that need to be answered. But at the same time, pediatric patients who are helping us answer those questions have to have the prospect of benefiting from the intervention that's being investigated. So again, it's a prospect because it hasn't been proven yet. The trial will prove it, but it has to be there. And then also the question another question is whether the knowledge that's being gained through this research is enough to justify the risks that are at play. So I guess when I talk to people about this concept, I see a couple of camps. I see two camps, of folks who see it, of course, as a challenge because it can make things a little more difficult when you're trying to design a program. And then I see, a camp of folks who, see the value of it, but also sort of want to see it go further. I think the principles that are outlined in Subpart D are reasonable and clear. And a great way to think about ethics in pediatric research is simply that it's not just a regulatory requirement, even though it is, but it's actually a design principle.
Yeah.
So if you think about every decision, whether you're defining your research questions, whether you're designing your device, or you're planning the elements of your clinical trial, like if you view it from the lens of these ethical considerations, it really does then set you up for success in terms of being able to, streamline your interactions with the FDA and IRB on this particular topic. And lastly, I'll just say it's also important to keep in mind that these safeguards aren't intended to exclude children from being able to benefit from innovation, including really exciting, novel innovation that's coming down the pike. But it really is to ensure that we're just studying patients, including pediatric patients, in a safe and responsible way.
Yeah, that's great. And I know that you mentioned a couple of things that are unique to pediatrics where, for example, usability is maybe a unique concern because these are children oftentimes using devices or therapeutics. Brian Palmer in the chat was kind of commenting about that in terms of a full-blown clinical trial that's showing efficacy or safety evidence versus usability trials and like how a kid is using a device. Curious if you had any thoughts to that dynamic in terms of evidence generation when you're going and presenting to the FDA to say, usability is one aspect, but that safety and efficacy is the primary goal of like Subpart D and trying to make sure that these kids are safe as they do the trials.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. So that it is just one aspect, but all interventions and all trials and, research trials for FDA regulated products still need to adhere to these principles.
Right.
So it's not like, a certain type of investigation would exclude that, particularly if it involves an FDA regulated intervention again. But there are, of course, strategies and ways to design and include features that keep these things in mind. And, it is very, of course, context specifics. But let me just say, for example, if you have an intervention, a device and technology you're developing, and there's a need to, there's obviously questions around the safety, or there's questions that, in terms of how best to use it, in terms of the safety of it and ensuring that it's safe, ensuring that the trial has the appropriate risk mitigation strategies are parts of ways to be in compliance with Subpart D, for example. So, the monitoring, the risk mitigations, the rescue approaches, if necessary. Again, we're talking very generally. These are all features of an ethical design and things that, many are doing already and maybe don't even think about it in terms of like, oh, I'm doing this because it complies with Subpart D, but I'm also doing this because it makes sense for this trial and for the best protection of the patients, So it is organic when you kind of really look through some examples of how it is being implemented all the time, but you just maybe aren't thinking of it in the way of Subpart D.
Yeah, great points. Talking about where, Subpart D and others will talk about doing trials when there's no other way to find evidence and looking at other forms of evidence. I know we talked briefly or mentioned briefly about real-world evidence. I know that's been a very hot topic in terms of what FDA is doing with the new MDUFA 6 and is like bringing more real-world evidence, and NEST is bringing real-world evidence up to a level where we can start to use it and leverage it more. How has that changed pediatrics development from your perspective, the real-world evidence piece?
Yeah, I think it's really exciting. As you said, it's obviously the hot topic of many conversations over the last several years at FDA and amongst product development groups and stakeholders across the board. And I think that's for important reasons, because we're always searching, right, as a community who's involved in product development and regulation of, how can we build evidence in ways that end up being feasible, because there are so many areas of unmet need. We don't want to have to be able to say, well, because the trial's not feasible, then products can't move forward. When technology, the availability of data, our knowledge, our experience with clinical trials, the evidence that's been built up in general around various types of products and experience, but also our understanding of disease and biology, so much has advanced that it's really exciting for peds, because we're in such a, I think, interesting era in terms of product development for pediatrics, where the limitations that we had that were real, some of them are going to be able to be stripped away because of the power of the data that exists. So yes, real world data and real world evidence are certainly exciting topics to talk about for pediatrics. And I think this audience may know and be familiar with these terms, but just for clarity, we'll just remind everybody that FDA defines real world data as the data that is relating to patient health and to delivery of healthcare, and that is collected in a variety of ways, and registries, claims data, data from medical devices and digital health technologies, important in this context, of course, electronic health medical records. All of these things can constitute real world data. And then the evidence is the evidence that is gained about the usage and potential benefits of risk and benefits of medical products, and populations that can be derived from the analysis of real world data. And so our sophistication and ability to be able to apply statistical methodology, the ways we can analyze these types of data, have really empowered them to be able to be used in really interesting ways. And I think historically the agency has, always tapped into this type of data for, various means. I think we've seen it a lot in safety, of course. We've seen it a lot in post-market considerations. And we're starting to see different regulatory questions that can be answered or helped to be answered by these types of data. And so for pediatrics, I think there's several exciting things in progress. Some that has already been ongoing, but it's becoming more formalized, and some that's new. But, registries, for example, we have pediatric registry data. There's a lot of great groups that are maintaining that type of information. There's coordinated data networks. And when these are really thoughtfully designed, when there's standardized data elements, when there's consistent outcome definitions, and when there's a longitudinal aspect to them in terms of follow-up that's, formal and formalized, this data can really generate great insights into what normally would have been difficult to achieve in traditional clinical trials for pediatrics, or in other populations alone, so it's not just peds specific, of course, but, and I would also say that when we think about being able to leverage data from other populations, real world data and evidence really can help there, because it fills in some of the gaps in knowledge that may have existed, that we are able then to help confirm and support our assumptions around similarities and differences between populations. So extrapolation is one of those areas where, again, I'll just raise that it is tied to an ethical principle, because again, if we can answer questions using adult data and use that data to inform the way our thoughts are and evidence that supports safety and effectiveness of that use of that device in peds, then we're avoiding exposing children to an unnecessary trial and an unnecessary research intervention, for example. And real world data and evidence can really help by really helping to provide further evidence and support for the bridge of evidence between, again, the similarities between those populations. And then lastly, I would just like to say that, when I think about some of the limitations that we've had so long for pediatrics when, they're being cared for in a healthcare setting, many are receiving interventions, whether they're medicines, biologics, drugs, and devices, at time points in their lives, of course, when they're still growing and developing, that then may have implications for years to come. Yeah. But capturing that information and understanding that, which is critical for patients and families, and just understanding the best use of products, the safest use of products, has been hard, right, to do, because, it's hard to run 5-year studies or 10-year studies. But again, real world data and evidence and longitudinal data is really helping us to be able to get there and fill in some of those important gaps that really can't be answered sometimes in the pre-market setting, or definitely can't be answered necessarily in a traditional clinical trial, again, because of feasibility and considerations, but now could be answered and help us to have more assurance in the way these products perform. So it's very exciting for pediatrics, I think, and really looking forward to all this to come here.
For sure. Yeah. And I'm sure that as the agency sees more of these opportunities and even companies start to consider that as part of their strategy, I think there'll be not a lot of evolution necessarily, but more proficiency in terms of what types of evidence can come from the real world evidence side to supplement traditional clinical trial. And I think right now, going back to your early and often engagement with the FDA, recommending to companies to go talk to the FDA about how you want to use real world evidence and what your strategy is, because we've seen some instances where companies assume that they can just bring registry data or real world evidence to the table, and that'll be enough to clear the clinical evidence hurdle. And maybe it does to some degree, but then it leaves some key efficacy or safety or usability considerations unanswered, and then they have to go back and realize, okay, I can't just do everything in silico or in simulation. I do have to generate some clear evidence. And then what's the demarcation line between the subpart D conversation of what really is needed to be generated in a clinical setting, because we don't have that data or we can't figure out how to find that in the real world evidence. So just a reiteration of what you were saying and kind of putting those pieces together.
Absolutely. And yes, early, if you're planning a real world data or evidence strategy as part of your program, early conversations with the agency, and be prepared to answer to them what is the regulatory question that data or that evidence is going to be able to provide. And to your point, is it really complementary evidence? Or is it robust enough to serve another purpose? And I will say in many cases, many of the cases that we've seen, it is complementary. And I don't think the goal is necessarily always that, these are two competing things in terms of traditional trials and real world evidence and data, that they are meant to replace each other completely. They have features within themselves that serve purposes. And so they are often complementary to each other. And like I mentioned, they can help answer questions that one or the other couldn't address. But one of the things that I want to point out and mention about this topic is, the FDA has, issued a plethora of guidances now on this topic because it is so important. And I think they've expressed multiple times in many forums their commitment to really continuing to incorporate this as an evidence approach into various aspects of the regulatory process. So, they're going to be talking about things like, is it fit for purpose? They're going to be talking about, is the data reliable and relevant enough to answer the question that you're saying it can answer? They're really going to be interrogating the quality because, real world data, there's a lot of that. But in terms of what is actual real world evidence, I think people would be surprised to your point about, that just, presenting a registry data set doesn't quite make that bar.
Yeah.
And the reason is because, there's so many quality checks and balances that have to be in place. How were the data collected?
Right.
Are the patients representative of the intended use population that you're pursuing? Are there clinically important variables that are captured prospectively and consistently, or prospectively and captured consistently? Can the outcomes be measured accurately and captured within that data set? And a very big important part is, are there any sources of bias or confounding that can be found there? And how do you make sure that you're proactively designing your approach so that those things can be mitigated? Missing data is another big one. Is there a lot of missing data? Because these are the things that really impede the agency and the reviewers from being able to interpret the meaning out of this data. And again, that weakens then the ability for it to serve as evidence. So all of these things are so critical. So yes, early discussions with the agency, thorough reading of those guidances, and really, really being intentional when you're planning and building these things that would serve as real world data and real world evidence.
Yeah. Wonderful points. This has been really awesome. I'm sure, like you mentioned, we could probably dive a whole new conversation down that road of clinical evidence. But I wanted to kind of bring it back to what you had mentioned as far as your experience with CDER and CDRH and kind of cross-cutting the agency, and kind of maybe taking the conversation more towards what is being done at a high level to help incentivize pediatrics. And obviously we have things like the Pediatric Device Consortiums here to try and incentivize startups and adult products to look at resources that could benefit them in the product development process and through getting to the FDA, and even having we have PCI meetings with the chief of pediatrics where we can kind of do this early engagement type interaction with the FDA. If those listening are interested, please come contact me. But what from your perspective, could be done from a policy perspective or an incentive perspective with the FDA, with the agency, even Congress, that you think could help push pediatrics in terms of incentives and product development?
Yeah, this is, of course, the sort of question of the hour. We've made so much progress, and the collective we, of course, I'm always talking about. There's just been so much progress. Every interested party that's involved here has done so much work over the last several decades so that we're even where we are today, right? To be able to be at thankfully a different place than what had been in terms of just the complete disregard for pediatric product development. From my experience in working in the agency and working in the Office of Pediatric Therapeutics, a couple of things became very apparent to me. One is that the considerations around these aspects of policies and advancing spaces, there are some cross-cutting aspects, but there are also many aspects that are specific to the product type. So what I mean by that is, on the drugs and biologics side, there are incentives and requirements that are resulting in a pediatric drug development ecosystem and paradigm that's very different from what's happening on the device side. But also, those same requirements and incentive types may not be the appropriate ones to consider on the device side, because the markets, the dynamics, the ecosystems are so different. Again, there's some similarities, but there's a lot of differences, and those differences cannot be ignored. I have to say, though, I spent a lot of my time, as I mentioned, in the Center for Drugs, and I saw firsthand that incentives are powerful and mandates are powerful, and they certainly do have an effect, but they always have to be revisited in terms of, are they achieving the effect that's needed as we are as sort of the ecosystem of product development changes, like sort of in these modern times, for example. So that's just an opening remark I wanted to say, because I want to make sure everyone knows that, some of these things aren't apples to apples. But on the device side, yeah, there's been a lot of great progress. There's a lot of attention on this issue at the agency for years, as I mentioned. And to your point, groups like the PDCs play such an important role in helping to manage sort of all of these competing challenges that really do need solutions. So the first thing I would say is, when we talk about like, well, what is that? I think from my experience, what's become clear to me is it's not any one single thing. It's such a complex issue. There's so many interconnected aspects, some of which are outside of FDA and outside of the sponsor. They don't, like, there's no, those aspects aren't controlled by these two groups, and I'm talking about things like, for example, reimbursements and, the economics behind developing devices that actually end up getting to the patients that need them. So beyond clearance and approval, access, right? So those are like bigger picture issues, but they're so important and they're complementary. So that's what I mean, that there's really not one solve, but there are pieces, if we can think about them as pieces into a greater puzzle, that if we can have them all sort of developed and policies in place, moving in the right direction, we could see some major impact. So things like, if we go back to incentives, right now we know that for those who have an interest of developing products in the pediatric space, or they have an adult device that they want to extend an indication, even if it's not pediatric specific, for example, the market dynamics, the economics aren't favorable. The size of the patient populations aren't favorable to supporting that decision sometimes. And, there is a need for financial or other types of incentives that spark that ability to be able to enter into those spaces. On the drug side, we have what's known as the Best Pharmaceuticals for Children's Act, which provides pediatric exclusivity. We also have the Orphan Drug Act. And we don't have those same types of features on the device side. So I think there's been many conversations, think tanks, workshops, people have proposed such a thing. I think, it's something that needs to be discussed very seriously. There needs to be some type of incentive, but that's tailored for the specific goal of being able to counter the true economic dynamics that are at play. And so people like yourself, like the folks in this audience, industry, of course, their voices are needed there, right? Because they need to be able to express, well, what would that look like? It can't be, oh, let's do something very similar to BPCA on the drug side, because it just doesn't work. It doesn't even match, because it's about patent exclusivity on that side, which is not a correlate over here. But it's needed. So I would say incentives. I think mandates, people get uncomfortable when you say the word mandate. I'm a former regulator, so I don't feel uncomfortable saying that word, but I do feel uncomfortable when we say mandates and just throw it out there like as a wholesale, because, a mandate doesn't mean every device, every sponsor, every situation. A mandate could be very tailored for a specific context that makes sense, that just helps move the needle in a certain direction. So again, I would just say that that's another area where very nuanced thought should be put in place, but we should keep our minds open that there could be a world in which there are tailored mandates and there are effective incentives in this space. And then I would say the PDCs, the funding of the PDCs, there's so much that's been able to be done with the funds that are allocated, but, and I'm so grateful that Congress did continue to keep the program going. But I think it's very clear that, much more could be done if there were additional funds that are allocated that really could help, establish more PDCs, establish more capacity and scope within those PDCs, because they are serving such an important function of being able to be a key resource of expertise, of abilities, of execution, to really be able to make a major difference in PEDS device development, which is already happening. So I would say that. And then I would also lastly say, and happy to open it up because I'd love to hear your thoughts too, but I would also say policies that incentivize, not incentivize that, but actually structure collaboration. Because I do think, we saw glimpses of that through things like ShipMD and the Pediatric Medical Device Public-Private Partnership. We are on the edge of really an amazing potential for an infrastructure that was envisioned through these concepts. But, those types of concepts have to be supported, of course, through funding. They have to be supported, of course, through the key groups that are going to, take the charge and be responsible for the outcomes and deliverables of those types of major initiatives. But I think so much work has gone in to thinking through some of the issues in this space of pediatric device development through groups and initiatives like that were collaborative, that included a wide range of voices and stakeholder perspectives, that it would be, just such a shame for that to not continue to progress. So I would hope that policies can help support those types of initiatives and keep them sustainable.
Yeah, I agree. And just from the PDC perspective too, I was thinking about some of the incentives that have started to come out through the medical device user fees amendments, and some of the incentives where I know, for example, companies that have a pediatric only indication can have their establishment registration fees waived. Small things like that, inclusion in the TAP program. And I know that TAP is now expanding into the RAPID program for those that aren't familiar, looking at the reimbursement side of things when it comes to total product lifecycle development and involving CMS into that. So we're encouraged, I think, to double down on what you were saying, Deanna, about we're starting to see some incentives come up. Obviously, there's no mandate to quash any off-label usage or anything like that. But small things that we're building for the PDCs, the public-private partnership for pediatric medical device development, the PMD that you mentioned, there is encouraging things. And I know right now, for those that are in the regulatory space, regulatory nerds like me, looking at the MDUFA 6 discussions and what's coming out of the FDA about how these programs are evolving and how the fees are going to be applied, and are there incentives and the PDCs as they continue to evolve. So just some comments from my perspective on that end as well. But yeah, thank you for that.
And I would just say too, just a very broad comment, the agency has such amazing staff and expertise that's there for these things, once they come into place, or if they're being proposed, to then be able to be implemented when it relates to actions for the FDA. It's so important to then fund and support the staff needed. Those with pediatric expertise or experience with pediatric device development. We need those types of folks who then can help the broader ecosystem navigate these things, but also can be the champions that keep them moving in the agency. So we do need that.
Yeah, 100%. This is great. Well, to round out our conversation, obviously, if there are any other comments or questions from the audience, please feel free to ask that. We'll give some time at the end for Q&A here. But Deanna, in terms of those that are looking at pediatrics, maybe from the outside, whether they're an adult device or they're a new technology coming out of a tech transfer office somewhere, are there pieces of advice other than what we've talked about with engaging the FDA and clinical evidence that you would give to them for those considering to join the pediatric medtech space specifically?
Yes, I think one thing we didn't touch on, but it's super important and also very much of interest to the agency, is the incorporation of patient and caregiver and healthcare provider voice in this process. We cannot forget their value. And for those entering into the space, let me put the plug in to say, that is a resource to absolutely tap into. Again, we know our programs well, we know the devices we're building, but these are the experts in actually the lived experience of their conditions and diseases, or the lived experience of being the caregiver or healthcare provider for those diseases and conditions. And so their insights into what's meaningful, what a change in an outcome actually translates into, what are the quality of life considerations. These are the types of, what are the usability considerations for a device, for example? What are the unmet needs? These are the things that really can help shape your design as well as your program in a way to even strengthen it more for success. And the agency has actually spent a lot of time talking about their commitment to incorporating this type of information into the regulatory process, and their encouragement of developers really incorporating it into their process from the earliest stages. And I think we begin to see the fruits of that, because I do think we're starting to see more trials design, more programs design, more evidence packages, including these perspectives and insights, but also getting programs that people are willing to enroll into. If you know up front what is considered extreme burden, what is considered a reasonable trial design from the folks that you're going to hopefully recruit, that helps you, but that also helps the agency as they're trying to provide advice on the types of expectations around the trials they think are needed. So I just feel like that is also such an important thing of advice that I would say that we haven't covered today, that continues to be at the forefront, I think, of shifting and evolving pediatric device development.
That's great. Yeah, thanks for that. A question from the audience talking about international data when it comes to clinical trials and real-world evidence. Your perspective on how to incorporate data that's not generated within the US and how to include that in the evidence package that you would then take to the FDA?
Yes. So I think it would still, require the same types of interrogation that I mentioned before about the quality of that data, about, the population and whether it's representative of the population likely to use the device if it's approved or cleared in the US. That's a big one. Whether or not the care, the healthcare setting, the standards of care, like what differences are there? Because these are the types of things that introduce confounding factors or make variability in the data set that then hurt interpretation. So really thinking about that. I think sometimes people forget to think about, they think about like, so is the population representative? Yes, it's the same disease. Okay, so they think that's it. But are they also treated similarly? Are they have the same types of standards of care, healthcare settings? What could make that data different? So you just want to always interrogate to prove and show that the data is similar. So even when you're picking where you're getting your data, that should be at the forefront. Is this population likely to be most representative? So that's one thing. And then I think that, it is not unusual for data sets to include data that's not necessarily derived or generated in the US. So that's something that's not uncommon. But again, it's not a matter of just kind of grouping it all together. You really have to be thoughtful to think about, is it able to join in and be complementary to the data that you have? And in the cases where it's solely from outside the US, again, that's when really more scrutiny is placed on those questions that I asked. And then if you can answer those questions and provide a strong justification for why it is representative, then, the agency is an evidence-based agency, and the discussions and the decisions are made based on evidence. So it does require a really strong justification and the supportive information that supports that evidence is appropriate.
Yeah, well said. Well, Deanna, thank you again so much for your time, and thank you for everyone watching. I wish we had more time to dive into clinical evidence and a lot of other topics, but thank you so much. And obviously, if there are follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to us at the MPDC through our connection channels on our website, through LinkedIn. We encourage you guys to be a part of this ecosystem and talk as a community about some of these challenges and some of these aspects. And Deanna, thanks for your time and your expertise in all of this. And people can find you at Canal Row, correct? So if the people are interested in your guys' services, maybe a little bit of plug for Canal Row there.
Yes, please feel free to check out our website, which is canalrow.com, and see the services that we offer. In addition to some of the things that I discussed, we actually have a real world evidence practice. So I want to give a plug there, where we really help companies think about their real world evidence strategy and the types of information and data they need to be as strong as possible. And I also want to mention we have a very strong clinical and regulatory strategy practice, which from, nuts to bolts really goes from your planning stage all the way through to your execution and interactions with the agency, as well as post-market consideration. So it really runs the gamut. And then we have quality and compliance, advisory services, and regulatory policy. So again, that's at canalrow.com.
Awesome. Great. Deanna, thank you again so much for your time. Lindsay, thanks for hosting with me. And thank you to everyone for watching on the MPDC webinar. If you're interested, follow up. And we thank you again for your time. Have a great day, everyone.